Every time I see the kids, the children walk out, I can't help but wonder, how do they look at church? How do they view the church? And I see Fawn and Faith up here, baptism, beautiful thing, God claiming them as his children, forgiveness, and yet that there's such a long life ahead of them too, and by God's grace. And when I look out amongst everybody here as well, I know that each and every one of us probably has a different perspective on the church based on our own experiences in life. And a lot of that has to do with how we were raised, how we viewed the church as children, and how other people spoke of it. And perhaps maybe even your own experiences within it. And so I know that, as an example, this is why I've shared before, I enjoy partnering with Pastor Milets here at Shepherd of the Lakes, having him as a colleague, because he grew up in a family that didn't go to church. And I'm the exact opposite. I grew up in a house where we went to church every single week. Some of you, you could probably relate to different aspects. Or some of you maybe grew up caring less about church. Some of you might have grown up with maybe some anger harbored towards the church because of an experience. And some of you I know have gone your entire lives. And so we have all those different perspectives in mind. The reason, and it's sometimes feels, like for me, when I hear people who are angry at the church, it's hard sometimes for me to initially relate. I can understand why difficult things can happen within the church. But for me growing up, I had a good experience in the church. I've never harbored anger or resentment toward the church. And one of the reasons, of course, why I attended every week, I'll be honest, my dad was a pastor. And I had two grandparents, two grandfathers, who are also pastors, and so it was kind of one of those things. It was just part of life. You went to worship. You participated in the life of the church. And sure, that was something that as a pastor's kid, I knew that was something that we did. My dad's a pastor, but I can tell you that there are many pastors' kids who fall away, largely because their lives are so ingrained in the church. And for me, I had a very good experience growing up, and my parents were very helpful in walking me through it all and helping me see why it should be a part of my life, not just because dad goes there, dad works there, okay? And so one of the earliest memories that I have in the church is my dad's first place he was at, the first church he was at in Wayne, Nebraska. It was a small town. It's about 5,000 to 8,000 people. It was a farming community. But the church was, it was kind of a center for that whole community. People kind of saw it as a gathering point. It attracted people. It had clout in the community. And so, and just to give you an example of how the church was attractive and it kind of drew people, just one simple example. I can still remember as a kid coming out of worship and seeing this gentleman who was a member in his car with gallon buckets, and they were full of fish that he had caught that morning. Okay, and the reason I'm making this point is he was a member and he would attend, but he liked to fish a lot, and a lot of times he'd fish on Sunday mornings. And of course, where do you go to show everybody what you caught? Well, you go to church. And who do you show it to? Not just the people, but the pastors after you've missed worship, And so, and it took me a while to, as a kid, I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool, fish. And after a while, I was like, hey, wait a minute, he didn't go to worship, did he? No, he didn't, So while he may not have had the clearest, his relationship with God might have been something that he needed to work on a little bit. At the same time, though, he saw the church as something that he gathered around. That was where the people were. And what we've been talking about here in the last couple of weeks, and what we're focusing on this summer, is how the church no longer has the position it once had in society. It's kind of on the downslide in terms of having a prominent position, okay? And so, that church in Nebraska, as an example, you don't see that very often where people are just attracted to church. You can't just build a church anymore in general, have a bunch of cool stuff, and just expect people to come. Okay, Livingston County sometimes bucks that trend a little bit to a certain degree, but the time's coming. It's a nationwide trend where people are just not attracted to the church anymore, especially if I'm going to go there and I can get something even better at a place that's not a church. And so we talked about how the church is post-attractional, and then last week we talked about how the church is post-positional. Remember how I said that my dad was actually very respected because he had the title pastor, And the church was an important place in the community, and people looked to the church. But that's just not the way things really operate anymore. You know, you see, more and more you're seeing pastors having to earn the authority and respect that a pastor used to just take for granted. And you have to earn it a lot of times by building relationships with people. And the church is no different. The church isn't just going to be a place that people look to as a source of authority. Instead, when you look at the surrounding community, when you even here in Livingston County, when you talk to people, the churches they talk about are the churches that have worked on building relationships in the surrounding communities. They're known by how they serve and love around. And so once again, people don't just say, oh, that church is awesome because it's a church. No, they ask, what kind of relationships that church has built in the surrounding community. Okay? So the church is sliding from a place of prominence. We're post-attractional, post-positional, and today I'm going to dig into a little bit more about how we're post-universal. And what I mean by this is we live in a society that is no longer speaking with the same language. We don't all share the same worldview. There was a time, like my dad could sit there, in that town, and he could talk about God and sin, and you could make the assumptions that people would kind of at least basically grasp what you're talking about, or we'd be on the same page. And that's just not the case anymore. When you go out of these walls and you start talking to people, just even in our surrounding community, you find more and more that there is not a universal worldview. People have all sorts of different ways of looking at humanity, and looking at God, and using a lot of the terms that we use quite frequently right here together as a church family. And so the question is how do we, and this is something I want you to think about, how do we, as a community, as a church, and as individuals, how do we engage in a culture that in some ways is oftentimes opposed to us? How do we as a church have more of an influence on the culture rather than the culture having such an influence on us? Because it does. It really does. And so I'd like to, the good place to start would be Acts 17 that Pastor Miletz read just a little while ago. And in Acts 17, you come across Paul. Paul wrote a huge chunk of the New Testament. And in the book of Acts, Paul was a church planter. He went around different places, and the way he planted churches was by basically evangelizing, sharing Jesus with people. And you find out that there are two distinct groups of people that Paul reached out to. He prominently went to non-Jews, but he did reach out to Jews as well. A lot of times he'd go to a community and he'd speak to Jewish communities. And when he spoke to Jews, what do you think was the advantage there? They spoke the language. He could talk to them and he could talk about God, and he'd know that they were talking about the same God. They understood Scripture. They looked at humanity and saw brokenness. They saw sinfulness. They knew that sin needed to be atoned for. They made sacrifices to God. And there's so many connections that you can make to talk about Jesus. So you see, he could use some of that insider language. But then in Acts 17, it's an example of where he found himself with this other group, the Greeks. He found himself in Athens, Greece, and the Greeks were very different. They really held on a pedestal reason and logic. They're intellectuals. When you said the word God, they'd think all sorts of different things. Some people might say, there's no God. Or if you talked about God, they might say, which one? You could not take language for granted. And so how did Paul engage them? How did Paul seek to engage them? Well, you see, Paul sought to be present amongst them. And we find out early in Acts 17 what he did is he went to the marketplace, okay? The agora is what it's also known as. And you should understand that the marketplace, we think of that, we think like grocery store, go get food, be fun, go get food, buy stuff. Yeah, that kind of stuff was going on there, but you also, remember, they didn't have computers, phones, anything like that. So where do you go to socialize in that society? You would go to the marketplace. That's where the intellectuals would go to debate and to talk. That's where the politicians would be. That's where people would go to hang out with their friends. That's where you go to buy things. That's where the business people were. That's where everybody was. And so Paul went to be present amongst them. And the thing is every single day we go to the marketplace. Think about that. We do. We go to the marketplace in our own ways, whether it's through social media. That's how we interact with people. Or whether it's going to work, okay? Or whether it's going to school for some of you teens and younger kids here. You go to school, you hang out with your friends, teachers, before you come home. And actually, I was just at some graduation parties yesterday for seniors, and so like for parents, it's kind of scary because who have seniors going to college, because what's happening? They're really going to the marketplace without mom and dad to talk to at the end of the day. And it's kind of scary. And the reason for me it's kind of scary thinking about how we go to the marketplace every single day is because we're in some ways unprepared. You go out there, you start interacting with people, and people are making assumptions about humanity to start with. And what do you hear? You hear things, basically, the more and more people talk about how hope, where do you find hope? Where do you look for hope? Right here. You can figure it all out on your own. You have to find the strength inside you. You have to make a difference. Now hold on here, and I understand that there's order in the world and that God calls us to do good things and he calls us to love, certainly. But if I'm starting with myself and looking to myself all the time for hope, that's a lot of burden. That's a lot of weight on my shoulders. But that's the way people think. God, talk about God. What assumptions do people make about God? Well, some might say is an antiquated idea. That's then. This is now. We're progressing. We're moving forward into the world. Okay? We need to trust more ourselves. We need to grow as a society, progress, and leave those old ideas behind. Or you might have some people that say, oh, I believe in a higher power. I believe in God. I believe in this idea of a higher being. But you know what? All the religions of the world, they kind of talk about the same God. They're all just different ways to get there, right? You know? Or you might just say, I believe in God, but you know what? I can't know anything about him, so why do I bother? Why do I even bother going to church? And you see, because of those assumptions about humanity, about God, those are two huge things. What happens by virtue of the fact that we're not looking to God first for our hope, what we do is we then start to distort some of the terminology we use in our daily lives. And you see that with people. They talk about love. They talk about justice and forgiveness. And what do we mean by those terms? Love, as an example, becomes the way that you make me feel, or the way that thing makes me feel. And that's certainly a way we can use it, but a biblical understanding is sacrificial love, seeking the greatest good of the other, outward focused. You see the distinction there? Justice is the same thing. So we look at things in the world and we want justice according to the way I feel justice should be done, rather than focusing first on God. And so you have all of this stuff going on in the world as you go out to the marketplace. All these things that you come in contact with, and then what happens on top of it? You turn on the news and you hear about a shooting in Charleston at a church. A young person goes in there and just shoots a bunch of people and kills like 9 people, including the pastor. And it's like, what kind of world do we live in? And then you look around in your life, you see other people, and you see people are hurting, who are despairing. You look in your own life and you struggle with your own insecurities, and it's like, how in the world can I go out there and make any difference? The question to be asked really is this: where do I start? Where do I start? And this is why I've been kind of talking about they, them, out there, and I'm kind of bringing it back here to you and me. Where do I start? Because I can't go out there unless I know where to start. And the place that I should start is Christ, is Jesus. Okay? I was looking on Facebook yesterday, and one of our younger members in the congregation had a nice little post I saw that, he was talking about how this Charleston shooting in the church was this horrible thing, and just how you see so much garbage in the world. But he said, this is why I cling to the hope of a risen Jesus. That's where you turn. Because you see, if I disconnect everything from Jesus and I'm going to expect the world to be perfect, if it's not perfect, then, well, God's a horrible God. But when I look to the cross, what I see is a God who suffers with me, who suffers for me. And when I look to the cross, I get a clear picture of myself. I can't look inside for hope. You see, God had to bring hope to me through Jesus. Because if I place everything on my own shoulders, I am going to be crushed. And so I start by looking to Christ, seeing the hope that's found there, and hearing those words, you are forgiven, you are loved, you are mine. Wow. It's going to take a load off. And that has nothing to do with what I have or have not done. It has everything to do with what he has done. So that's what Jesus does when he comes to you. But let's take this one step further here. Okay, now Jesus comes to you. He says, you are forgiven. You are loved. You are mine. Forgiven. That's grace. Unconditional love. And when somebody shows you that kind of a love, do you just say, that's cool, and then you walk out the door and never talk to them again? No, usually when somebody does something like that for you, when somebody shows you love, you usually engage in a relationship with them, wouldn't you? On a human level, isn't that what we do? When people love us like that, we want to be around them more, don't we? Let me share a little bit of a difference between a relationship and an acquaintance. An acquaintance looks like this. I'm walking down the hallway. Hey, how are you doing today? Good. How are you doing? Good, good. See you tomorrow. Cool. That's an acquaintance. Nothing but surface level, okay? Sometimes you feel like your relationship with Jesus is kind of like that. Hey, Jesus, how you doing? Good, cool, good, good day, good, good. See you next Sunday. Cool. That's an acquaintance. It's not a relationship. You're not getting to know him. You're not learning more about him. You're not digging into the Word. And this is exactly why Pastor Miles and myself are constantly encouraging you to get in a Bible study, to dig into the Word, because that is how you take that initial hope that we set our eyes on. You start to dig deeper, and you start to experience deep healing, and you start to experience a relationship with God in ways that you never could possibly fathom as his truth hits your heart. And then what do? As we gather together, as we set our eyes on the hope that we have in Jesus, as we get into the Word, what do we take? Where do we take Jesus next? We have this relationship. We take him home, right? That's the idea. Take him home, and we share them with one another, with our spouses, with our friends, with our children, our grandchildren. We take Jesus home. And as we do so, we remember that words have power. I want you to think about this. You ever realize that words themselves can sometimes hurt just as much, if not more so, than physical harm? Or, words, they have power. They have the ability to do things sometimes that when we... I think about like spouses who are struggling in their marriage, or siblings, brothers and sisters, fighting with one another. When we know one another really well at home, sometimes we can use words that really hurt and harm. The words that we use have power, and we wield them without ever sometimes considering what it's doing to the other person. And honestly, sometimes we do it knowing exactly what it's going to do to that other person. And the words that we use at home, the words we use amongst those people we gather, those words can also confuse. When I go home and I talk about God and I use all these words and I don't really know how it all fits together, I can actually cause confusion, in my own faith walk and in the walk of other people. And that's why getting into the Word and then using that language I've learned at home is so important. So words have power, and they can have power in a negative way, in a hurtful way, in a way that distorts, but they can also have incredible power in a positive way. Think about this. Words can be used to bridge gaps. When you see somebody who's hurting, when you see a child that is just distraught and hurting and just angry, is the best way to start by saying, "Stop it!" Or it might be better to use words, empathetic words, and use words such as, "I can tell you're having a hard day. You want to share? Can you tell me a little bit more?" Learning more about their world. You see, the words we use, the softness of our words can sometimes bridge gaps. And when we know how to share the hope of Jesus with other people, when we learn how to share it with other people, the words we use at home, those words of love, forgiveness, hope, takes on a whole new meaning. I want you to think about this. So I'm called to start by looking at Christ, getting into the Word, developing a relationship with God, and then taking him home, right? Okay? Remembering that words have power, practicing the words that I use, and then I'm called to really enter into the world. This is what Paul did. Think about this. Paul didn't go into the world before he had any understanding of Jesus or anything like that. He was prepared. He was strong in his faith. He looked to Christ as his hope, okay? And understanding all that, he could enter into the world and speak truth. And how did Paul seek to do so? Like I said, he sought to be present with people. So his starting point wasn't, okay, I want to teach people about sin. I'm going to teach people about God. No, his starting point was looking around and seeing the culture. And when he looked around, he saw Greeks who were philosophers, who were intellectuals. And so what he did was he engaged them in an intellectual discussion. It's exactly what he did. And sometimes we can see this working in the world today. We can see intellectual discussions actually bearing fruit. one of the advantages, several experiences I've had over the course of the last 2 years, especially as I started Genesis Community, is I've found a lot of people sitting across from me in my office sometimes or in other places who do not, who are hurt by the church or disconnected from the church or just, haven't thought the church is an important part of their life at all. And when I engage people, there are times when I can say, if you look around, you see order, right? Okay, so that there's an example of a higher power, and you can say, well, if you look around, you also see chaos, you see disorder, you see brokenness. Yeah, it's sin. Let me talk to you about that. We all have a disease, right? And God isn't just a creator. He comes to us. He serves us. He loves us, and that's where Jesus fits in. And when I start sharing the gospel, you can sometimes see the light go on. It's like, I've never heard the Christian faith articulated like this. You mean it's about Jesus and what he's done? It's not about what I do? It's crazy how many people believe that Christian faith is first and foremost about morality. Yes, that's a part of it, but it's first and foremost about Jesus, his performance, because we fail. And when people hear that, it just kind of opens their eyes. But you know what? I can make the greatest argument in the world, just like Paul did, and sometimes I'll talk to somebody, and there's just kind of a glazed over look on their face. It's like, what? Okay. Why should I care? I really don't care about all this rational, logical stuff. You get that sometimes, and that's because feelings and experience will hold God at a distance, and all this jargon, all this stuff that I can try as until I'm blue in the face, and they just won't listen. And this was something that I have learned the hard way over and over and over again. And when we started Genesis Community about 2 years ago, this was something I thought about a lot. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's an outreach community we have here. And we were seeking to bring people from the community who are hurting or disconnected from the church, just needed a safe place to learn about God's love. And I knew that when I was going to do this, I found myself doing things I never thought I'd do. I started learning about 12 steps as an example. Why? Because a lot of people who have been hurting have been through 12-step programs, and it was common language that I could use to relate. I knew that there would be people coming who did not have a lot of money, who, getting food every day is a big deal. And so I knew that some would come, and the first thing they'd want is that they'd be coming back probably because we offer free food. And I'd have to be patient. I'd have to walk with them. And in some cases, I'd have to actually go maybe to their house and visit with them. I knew that there'd be people that have stories that don't relate to my own, and I was going to have to actually be present, listen to their story, and hear where they're coming from before I share anything, before I could expect them to listen to anything. And what's really, we sometimes don't realize is that having a walk with Jesus, it does take some effort. Growing in our relationship with God. And in the same way, it takes effort to walk with other people. It's not easy to evangelize, to share the faith with other people. We want the easy way out. We want to be able to say, hey, let me tell you about Jesus. Oh, they got it. Good. All right, now I can go back and be comfortable. When you see somebody who needs God's love and needs to hear about him, it takes time. It takes patience. And I've seen this. I've seen people right here who have, as an example, brought people to Genesis and actually walked with them, talked with them. And I'm not talking about just for 1 week, but for a couple months, maybe sometimes more. And they didn't leave until that person was ready to stay and to hear more. And I've seen growth by patience and love and being present. It's such a huge part. When we enter into the world, it's important for us also to see the idolatry. So how can I share Jesus with other people? I have to see the idolatry. This is what Paul did. He looked around, he saw gods all over the place. There was a monument basically dedicated to an unknown God, and so that's where Paul started. He said, you see this unknown God? I want to tell you about him. And he used that as a starting point to get them to Jesus eventually, okay? And it's important for us to see the idols in our own lives. What are the things that we place above God? What are the things that we look for security, that we look for ultimate hope above and beyond God? Relationships are good. Money is good. Success is good. Getting approval from people, it's not a bad thing, but seeing those as ultimate things, the things we need above anything else, that's when it becomes an idol. And until you look to Jesus and you see, Jesus was successful for me. I have God's approval because of Jesus. I have the perfect relationship with God through Jesus. Until I can see that and apply the truth of the gospel to my own heart and see the idols in my own life, it's going to be very difficult for me to see it in others' lives. And so we apply the gospel to our own lives. We go out there and we see the idols in other people's lives, and when we see it, just like Paul did, we can find ways when the timing is right, not to sit there and say, hey, that's an idol. No, but to say, let me tell you about Jesus and how he gives you everything you're looking for in other things. In the midst of all of this, like I said, it's easy to kind of talk about them out there. We must remember always to keep our eyes on Christ, to keep our eyes on Jesus. This is what Paul knew. Paul knew that he couldn't save himself. He knew that he couldn't save other people. He needed a Savior every bit as much, if not more so, than anybody else. And that same truth is true for you and for me. I can't save myself. I'm a sinner. I can't save those people I care for who are hurting. But I know the one who can. I do know the cure. And that's why my encouragement for you is to keep your eyes on Jesus. Remember what unites us together as a community, the cross of Christ. Look to him. Grow in your relationship with him. Get in the Word. Take it home. Learn to speak. Enter into the world. Learn about others, but never lose sight of Christ. And when the opportunity presents itself, share your hope. Share your hope. May we do so with boldness and humility for the sake of Jesus. Amen.